Bible with you this morning. We are picking up where we left off last week in Daniel. God's people were far from home, in a kingdom called Babylon. But God hadn't forgotten about them. He hadn't left them. And even though the people of Babylon didn't know God, they knew there was something different about God's people. In fact, King Darius, the king over Babylon, had noticed someone very special in God's tribe. His name was Daniel. Daniel knew God and he loved him. God had made Daniel very clever and very wise. The king saw this and wanted to put Daniel in charge of the whole kingdom. It was a very important job. Daniel was good at his work and the king liked him. This made some of the king's men very jealous. How can we get rid of Daniel, they wondered. How can we get him in trouble with the king? It wasn't easy because Daniel was a good man who worked hard. He was faithful in all things and he gave thanks to God 3 times every day. The men began to plot. When the men saw that Daniel prayed to God 3 times a day, they had an idea. They would trick the king and get rid of Daniel forever. The men went straight to King Darius. "We need a new law," they told him. "Because you are such a wise and wonderful king, everyone must pray to you and to no one else. If anyone disobeys, you must throw them into the lion's den." The king liked this law. He didn't know they were tricking him, so he said yes. It wasn't long before Daniel heard about the new law, but it didn't stop him. He trusted God, so he kept praying to him. When the king's men saw Daniel asking God for help, they rushed off to the king to tell him. "Daniel is praying to his God," they said. "You must throw him to the lions because he's breaking your new law." King Darius realized he had been tricked, and his heart was sad. He liked Daniel, and he didn't want him to be hurt, but there was nothing he could do. Even he couldn't change the law. The king's men took Daniel and dropped him into the den full of hungry lions. "I hope that your God who you love will rescue you," said the king. So Daniel was left alone with the lions and the king went home. But the king was so worried about his friend that he didn't sleep at all. The minute the sun came up, he rushed to the lion's den. "Daniel," he shouted, "has your God rescued you from the lions?" The king heard a voice. "God has kept me safe," shouted Daniel. He sent an angel to keep the lions' mouths shut all night. The king was overjoyed. "Quickly, get Daniel out of the lion's den," he ordered. After a whole night surrounded by fierce and rather hungry lions, there wasn't a single scratch on Daniel. Daniel had trusted God, and God had kept him safe. As for the men who had tricked the king, well, they were in big trouble. Because of what God had done, King Darius made a new law. Everyone in my kingdom must pray only to Daniel's God. He is the true, living God who lives forever. His kingdom will last forever. He is a rescuing God who looks after his people, and he has saved Daniel from the lions. Let's read about Jonah. In a big city called Nineveh lived the worst enemies of God's people. "Jonah," said God, "go to Nineveh and tell everyone to stop all the bad things they are doing. Tell them to say sorry and to choose love instead." But Jonah did not want to go. These people were his enemies. How on earth could God love them? So Jonah jumped on a ship going away from Nineveh. He was trying to escape from God. But God sent a dangerous storm over the sea. The terrified sailors on the boat prayed to their gods to save them. Nothing happened. "It's my fault," said Jonah. "I'm running away from God. Throw me into the sea and the storm will stop." So they did, and the storm stopped. The sailors saw that Jonah's God was the only true God and thanked him for rescuing them. Meanwhile, God sent an enormous fish to swallow Jonah up. Jonah's plan to run away from God was not going well. After 3 days stuck inside the fish, he realized he had made a mistake. He prayed to God, and God told the fish to spit him out. "Now will you go?" God asked him. This time, Jonah went straight to Nineveh and gave them God's message. God loves you, but he doesn't like the way you are living. It's not what he made you for. He made you for something better. Say sorry and choose love. And do you know what? The people listened. Even the king listened and was sorry. He took off his royal clothes and put on a dirty, itchy sack instead. Then he announced to his people, everyone in Nineveh must say sorry to God. We must love him and change our lives. Jonah was shocked. The worst enemies of God's people had said they were sorry and changed their ways. What an amazing, happy ending. But Jonah didn't think so. He was angry. He couldn't understand why God loved these people. He didn't want to share God's love with other tribes. But God's love is bigger than that. His love is for everyone, even enemies. God's love is so big that he never gives up on his children, no matter what. Now God's people were scattered far from each other with no home of their own. Remember that they had been taken from their land? They had no king of their own to look after them, and no idea how God was going to rescue them. But God knew he hadn't forgotten his children or his plan for them. He was going to send them a very different kind of king, a king who would show them just how big God's love is. We're heading into the New Testament for the last two stories today. The first Christmas. God's people had been scattered and were far apart, a bit like the stars in the sky above Abraham. They didn't have a land of their own, and they didn't have a king who looked after them. God had told them that he would send them a rescuing king. He loved them and wouldn't give up on them. So here they were, waiting for a powerful rescuer who would be strong and battle their enemies for them. But God had a very different idea. This king wasn't going to be at all what they were expecting. He would be so much more. It all started when an angel visited Mary. Mary was an ordinary girl who was going to marry a man named Joseph. They were going to have an ordinary life, or so she thought. Mary, said the angel, God has chosen you to have a baby who will change the world. He is God's son. This came as a big surprise. But Mary loved God and trusted him, so she said, yes, I will do whatever God wants, she said. Not long afterward, just as the angel had said, Mary found that she was pregnant. When the baby was about to be born, Mary and Joseph had to go on a long journey. The emperor had sent everyone back to their hometowns to be counted. Joseph was from King David's town, Bethlehem. Remember good King David? He and Joseph were from the same family. So off to Bethlehem went Joseph, Mary, and the soon-to-be-born baby. The little town was packed full of visitors, and Joseph and Mary needed somewhere to stay, somewhere for Mary to have the baby. When they found a place, it wasn't fancy. In fact, it was the place where the animals slept. But there, with the sheep, the goats, and the donkeys, the baby was born. The promised baby, the one the angel had told Mary about, and the name they gave him was Jesus. God had sent his son to be born as a tiny little baby, and Jesus was going to change everything. This was the biggest, most glorious news in the world. Who would God tell first? A king or perhaps a queen? Nope. God told a group of shepherds. They were poor and dirty, and nobody thought they were very important. They were out in the fields watching their sheep and minding their own business, but all of a sudden, angels appeared. The sky was full of them. They were bright, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. They had important news. A baby has been born, they shouted. He is God's son. He will bring great joy to the whole world. God is glorious, great, and wonderful. The shepherds knew exactly what to do. Leaving their sheep behind, they ran as fast as they could to find the baby, and there he was, exactly where the angels had said he would be. Once they had seen him, they rushed to tell everyone what had happened and what the angels had told them. This baby was God's son, and he would be the rescuing king. Back in the fields, they sang songs to God, telling him how amazing he was. Page is stuck. When Jesus was born, a special star appeared in the night sky. Far away from Bethlehem, 3 wise men, called Magi, saw the star and knew what it meant. They had been waiting just like God's people. Now that the waiting was over, they wanted to see this new king. So they set out on a long journey, following the star that would take them to Jesus. When they found him at last, the Magi were overjoyed. They gave him special gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and bowed down because they knew who he was. You see, they knew that he was the special king God's people had been waiting for, the one that God had promised to send. the new king, had finally arrived. One more story for this morning, John the Baptist. This is John the Baptist. John lived in the wilderness, a place outside the city where wild animals live. He made his own clothes out of camel hair, itchy, and ate honey and locusts. Locusts are like grasshoppers and are delicious with honey. God had given John a very important job. He was telling everyone about Jesus, who had grown up by this time, and getting people ready for him. Crowds came from far and wide to listen to John the Baptist because he was teaching something exciting. He told the people about loving God and living life with him and how to say sorry for the things they had done wrong. John reminded them that God had made them to love others and told them to share their food and their clothes with people who didn't have enough. He also dipped people in the river to show that they were starting a new life with God. This is called baptizing. One day, as John was baptizing people in the Jordan River, he saw Jesus walking toward him. "There he is," John shouted, "the one I have been telling you about. He has come to change us and rescue us. The whole world will be different because of him." "John, I want you to baptize me," Jesus told him. "Me? Baptize you?" John said. "Yes," said Jesus. When John had baptized Jesus in the river, God's Spirit came down to Jesus like a dove. "You are my beloved Son," God said, "and my great joy." John was now ready to begin the work that God had, not John, Jesus. Jesus was now ready to begin the work that God had given him. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I hope you have a wonderful Sunday with your family, and see you next week.